Thank you, Nanor, for agreeing to speak with us. We were very pleased to publish your latest work, Zabel, Yessayan at the Threshold, with a fascinating subtitle, Key Texts on Armenians and Turks as Ottoman Subjects. This is mainly 11 new translations of Yessayan's work, as well as a very well-researched and engaging introduction, very fresh, I would say, that only draws more readers in. So just to get things going, how would you characterize Zabel Yessayan in late Ottoman and modern Armenian literature? Like, what is your sense of it if you had to put in a, not quite a nutshell, but relatively succinctly?
I would characterize her as an innovator, both a linguistic innovator and a thematic innovator. There's been a great deal of discussion about her as a feminist, which she was. There is no doubt that she was a feminist. She believed in the equality of men and women's rights. And so in that respect, she also self-identified as a feminist. She was also a political and social commentator, a humanitarian. She was an extremely cosmopolitan person, I would say. So the fact that she grew up between Istanbul and Paris was formative for her as a person and as a writer. And she was precociously aware of her political and social circumstances and the social necessities of growing up as an Ottoman Armenian woman and just growing up as an Ottoman Armenian subject. So in a nutshell, that's how I would characterize her. As a writer, she has been described as a psychological writer, which she was, but I think she tried to thread precisely sort of individual psychology, especially women's psychology, with political observation. And so I think one of the mistakes has been to disaggregate these two aspects of her work, is to not read the political underpinnings or even undertones of her psychological writings, and to not recognize the psychological dimensions of her political writings. So in some respect, this project was a way of synthesizing those two things. And that began with the very difficult task of recognizing this disaggregation in the first place, because a lot of the interpretations of Yessayan have been taken for granted and have sort of become dominant in the field.
Well, that's a great answer. You sort of touched on to my following question, which was, why do you pick these particular 11 translations as a basis of your work? Thematically, but also what I call historiographic. I'm a historian, obviously. It's how the Zabel Yessayan story has developed in recent years. I mean, it has almost a history to it. So how would you place, why have you picked these 11 translations, and how would you put that within the sort of historiographical tradition, historiographical discussions of Zabel Yessayan in recent years? I mean, is it just adding more to what we know type of contribution, or a corrective? You know, you want to make a statement saying it's very good, but look at this stuff as well, because it tells something very different that we thought we knew, we didn't know, or we are wrong actually. I think that's very much part of the academic process. You're putting your own reputation out there when you say so, but you're also challenging others, and that's an important part of academic progress. So again, I would actually congratulate you for having the guts to do that and pushing the field forward that way. So where do you see this specific 11 translations in terms of where you want the discussion you want to open around them?
The discussions I want to open around it are multidimensional. So when you speak of the historiography, it's not just about political historiography or social historiography, it's also about literary historiography. So this work developed from literary research initially, not from historical research. I was sort of mining for texts in which Armenians were trying to depict the Ottoman context in a way that wasn't reifying, that it wasn't exclusively antagonistic. That's sort of how my dissertation began. And I was looking for writers and writings that were commenting on social relations with Turks in an equitable manner to the extent possible. That's how I came upon these texts. And this coincided, my own personal search coincided with an opening up of Ottoman and Turkish literary scholarship. So Ottoman literary historiography has tended to erase non-Ottoman Turkish literary histories from its literary historiographies, which is the case for basically all of Ottoman and Turkish historiography. So you didn't really see Armenians come up in these literary historiographies. And actually a lot of the innovations, the interventions to bring in non-Turkish voices into Turkish literary historiography happened in Turkey by Turkish scholars. And they've done some very interesting research to show, for example, the Armeno-Turkish influence, so Armenian letters, Turkish literature on the development of Ottoman and Turkish literature. And there were other scholars like Johann Strauss, or for example, who does a very comprehensive reading of who was reading what in the Ottoman Empire. And this sort of project, or its germinal seeds, if you like, started developing in the context of that kind of scholarship. And it became apparent as I kept digging and digging that Zabel Yessayan was one of those who was very committed to bridging the Armenian and Turkish social and literary divide. So she, to my knowledge, never translated from Ottoman Turkish because her Ottoman Turkish was not good. Her husband's was, but hers was not. She, however, was apparently translated to Ottoman Turkish by whom I don't know. This comes up in Leon Keçayan's dissertation. I haven't had an opportunity to dig any further. So to the extent that I'm trying to make an intervention in historiography, it's primarily literary historiography to show that there was a kind of shared literary culture and literary history of which Zabel Yessayan was a part. She was not the only one. So I've done further research, which will appear eventually in my monograph, where Rupen Zakhtarian was another leading figure of a kind of what I call a literary diplomat, who was engaged in literary translations of Turkish into Armenian, for example. So what I'm trying to show is just how much more permeable and cross-pollinating the literary landscape was in the late 19th, early 20th century. Concomitant with that, as the material sort of appeared, or as I discovered through the texts that appear in this volume, Yessayan's commitments were never exclusively literary. Of course, they were also social. So she was very much interested in women's rights, not as simply Armenian women's rights, but women's rights in Turkey, both for Armenians and non-Armenians, Muslims and Christians. And there, I hope that opens up the door for further research into feminist history or history of women in the Ottoman Empire, and collaborations and cross-cultural sort of solidarity, if such things existed. But this is definitely sort of a stepping stone, I hope, in that direction.
Zabel Yessayan, of course, wrote many journals, right? And that's part of the quote-unquote problem, in the sense that it wasn't, she didn't write necessarily books, but she published in different places. How much of her work do you think has been mined, as you would say, is already known, has been cited, at least in bibliographies, if not in actual people's work? Can you give us a sense of how much more there might be out there that either hasn't seen light today effectively, or has been underappreciated or misunderstood?
In terms of being underappreciated and misunderstood, there's an enormous body of Zabel Yessayan's literature that hasn't really been properly read and interpreted or collated. So what I'm hoping to do in my next project, the Zabel Yessayan translation project, is to collate another almost dozen or so works that are thematically linked and that I think speak to that sort of synthesis of the personal and the social, the psychological and the political. And in that book as well, there are two previously unknown publications that I discovered in my forays into periodicals. I think a healthy percentage of her work, her published work in the periodicals, has been recorded. And I think we have Shushik Dasnavedian to thank for that. Now, that stated, Shushik Dasnavedian herself notes in her bibliography of Zabel Yessayan that there's still quite a bit out there that she has not included in this book. She doesn't indicate where, she doesn't indicate what. So we are left to sort of guess. The fact is that I wasn't out there looking for unpublished material by Zabel Yessayan. I stumbled upon them, which leads me to wonder whether if a systematic research program were undertaken, with a collaborative team of scholars, scanning the Armenian periodical press of this period, whether we might actually discover substantially more than we already have.
And how accessible are such journals physically to scholars today? I mean, do you have to go to Yerevan or any other specific library? I mean, or is it an elite phenomenon that privileged number of people might have the resources to do this type of work, and most of it is inaccessible, which is a problem, right? If you want to have a healthy debate, you need more people to know the raw material in order to be able to appreciate and engage the secondary literature, right? So from your perspective, I mean, where would you find or begin to find these elements?
Well, look, digital humanities and the internet really have democratized scholarly research.
Right.
And between the efforts of the joint libraries in Armenia and the funding from the Gulbenkian Foundation, quite a few of these periodicals are freely and immediately available for consultation online through the National Library of Armenia. And then we have these brilliant people at Krahavak blog post who also, using partly the NLA sources, put a lot of these periodicals online. They may not be absolutely comprehensive, but they're certainly easily available, and quite a few of the pieces that are included in this book, I was able to consult right here in Singapore without ever physically leaving the country during COVID, for example. That said, there are still, periodical archives such as those of Azad Amart that you need to be able to consult personally, or you need to collaborate with librarians who've been, in my case, very generous. Peter Magierski at Columbia University, for example. It was absolutely formative for this work. I couldn't have done it without him in locating and digitizing and sending me the material. The other wonderful thing that's happened is that the librarians at the NLA also are eager to receive requests from scholars, independent scholars like me, for example, for digitized material, and will do everything they can to accommodate those requests. So it need not be such an elite enterprise. Those who are curious can, just as I did, manage to find a lot of the material. I think collaboration is very important, however, if we want to be absolutely methodical about what we find and be, more or less certain, to the extent that's possible, that we have actually discovered everything there is to discover of Yessayan's work.
You got to be sensible about it. Yes, I think you already answered by saying that a significant part of her work is already accessible, and I didn't realize it was accessible online. So that also raises expectations of what one would expect from scholarship, and it's exciting in a sense, right? Otherwise, scholars are quite comfortable sitting on their chairs and saying, well, this is all we can do, and then that's, they pretty much stopped the work that they should be doing. Are you aware of any sort of graduate students, upcoming kids? I mean, is there interest, serious interest that you are aware of, or has anyone approached you? Because you have a lot to share.
Me personally, specifically on Zabel Yessayan, no, but on Ottoman Armenian literature, yes. On women's literature, yes. I do know that the previous edited volume, Captive Nights, has been very useful for more than one graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania, working with Professor David Kazanjan there, who've been working on sort of interventionist Ottoman Armenian historiography and women's histories and sort of discourses of race, racism, and ethnicity that also appears in the literature of this time.
Well, okay. We said we're going to keep this interview short so that in the focus. Thematically, I mean, you just mentioned race, racism. I mean, these are issues that you deal with in your book, right? I mean, these are relatively new in a field that Zabel Yessayan is touching on. Would other Armenian writers touch on these issues from her period? Was she in some ways a pathbreaker? I mean, do you have cross-cultural love, for example, or racial, ethnic lines and so forth? Is Zabel Yessayan, is it a theme that she engages and others don't? Do you think that she's
not exclusive, but she's in a very small minority. So I have identified others like Daniel Varujan, for example, it just depends on how you read the work. So much of it has to do with the hermeneutics,
Right.
which isn't immediately obvious if your training has been a very sort of nationalist one, right? The predominant discourse also is that there's nothing really there to see. So even, for example, someone as well read as Vahe Oshagan, right, the son of Hagop Oshagan, assumed that his father was the only person who ever wrote about this stuff, right? He put that in writing, and that's simply inaccurate. And I don't know whether that comes from a certain laziness. He wasn't lazy. He was an extraordinarily erudite and sophisticated scholar. But in his context, I think there was the presumption, and perhaps he believed his father a little too much, and his own father's megalomaniacal, maybe
Right.
self-affirmations, that he was the only one who did these and didn't really go and find out for himself. So if there's one thing that I would love for students or scholars to do, is to just basically judge matters for themselves. Don't take the prevailing judgments for granted as cardinal truths. Go back directly to the sources yourselves. And that's where that's where the treasure is, really. That's where you're going to find the most sort of rewarding material. And so aside from Zabel Yessayan, as I mentioned, there's Daniel Valujan, there's Vahan Tekeyan, I mean, very surprising materials. There is, of course, Bedros Tulian. So to what extent these are coextensive, their approaches to these sort of intercommunal or transcommunal or interracial or intercultural love and friendship, etc., they all have very different perspectives and literary approaches to explore the idea. But the fact is that they do. And the fact is that the very fact that they do has been marginalized or suppressed, or simply put entirely out of mind as a possibility.
In the source materials, do you come across discussions of Zabel Yessayan in the Armenian, say the Armenian periodical press? Was she a figure that people talked about, critical or sympathetic terms? Independent of what she wrote, what did people say about her? And how did they assess her work while she was alive? I mean, did she have an impact that she might even have been aware of?
Yes, I think that starts happening more sort of in the 1910s after, and in the 1920s. So Shushik Das Nabelian also has compiled a very useful list of scholars who were commenting on Yessayan at the time. I have to admit that I haven't really devoted much time to those, but I am aware that they do exist. So if the question is whether she was influential or well-read at the time, she most certainly was. And you can also deduce that from the correspondences. It's blatantly evident. So Leon Kecheyan has done an amazing job of compiling those correspondences and translating them. And you can see that Zabel Yessayan was in touch with all the key literary figures. She was invited to contribute to periodicals, which is another indication, major periodicals, right? Which is another indication that she was well-read and she was well-loved. And there was a great deal of expectation from her to keep writing, which she was very good at not disappointing.